Okay, so we're up to the beginnings of this response of Rabbi Weiss about taking tefillin. Sorry to go to a more serious topic, but we need to finish this tshuva. About whether tefillin could be taken into hospital if a person was to be hospitalized. And once again, this was written on the 4th of Nisan, earlier, or last Jewish year, earlier this calendar year. A short response in advance of Pesach to Dr. Elisha Kahan in Hendon, students of Rabbi Weiss, who had asked him about this. So Rabbi Weiss starts by noting that in the previous generations, of course, this was not a new question, it had been asked already, with regard to contagious diseases, where people would have to have, unfortunately, have any clothing or personal effects incinerated to avoid the spread of the diseases. And he notes that some of the great poskim of 3 generations ago, such as the Chazon Nachum and the Shavina Rav, who were great poskim, particularly in Eretz Yisrael, the latter, noted that using the paradigms we mentioned yesterday, that you should not take your tefillin in, and instead shevi al ta'aseh, that just don't perform the mitzvah because of what could happen to the tefillin. And Rabbi Weiss, in very beautiful language, says, and then in the next generation, as medical advances continued, and the question needed to be asked again because of a new context, he says, "V'shuv al tasha elaza al shulchan melachim al yadei gedolei hador shel achareha." And then this question arose on the table of kings of the great scholars, the generation after them, in particular Rabbi Moshe Feinstein and the Mincha Yitzchak, Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov Weiss, we both discussed on previous occasions. It's a very beautiful and respectful language from Rabbi Weiss. And he notes that they are held the same in their context as in the previous generation as well. Rabbi Weiss today, he says, there is much to write about this given various medical advances and the different circumstances which we are in. And also thinking about even if tefillin were to be destroyed, what the actual prohibition would be, especially if it's not a Jew who is destroying them themselves. And if there is a possibility of having other tefillin afterwards, particularly if the person is in hospital for a while, should they really be losing that mitzvah if as soon as they come out, you're able to get a new pair of tefillin, if again that is feasible. He raises all these questions and issues which today are I think, are much more relevant and easily considered than they were in previous generations. But he says, nonetheless, the halacha remains at a practical level, as was the decision of the great scholars who he quoted who came before him. And he says, these were amudei halacha l'chol Yisrael. These were pillars of halacha on whom the Jewish people rested for the responsibility which they took. We depended on them rather for the responsibility which they took and the scholarship and piety which they brought to that. So he says that one should follow that particular that stuck, and if one is in, God forbid, in such a ward, one should not take one's tefillin in. He says, nonetheless, obviously, and again he's writing this at the height of the pandemic, if there are any ways to avoid tefillin being destroyed or to have tefillin taken into the hospital, and perhaps they can even be quarantined for a period of time. Imagine if there was a 2 days Yom Tov and Shabbat, for instance. Does that allow enough time, 72 hours, to quarantine tefillin when we wouldn't be using them anyway? Perhaps make them the regulations would allow for them to be taken out of the hospital. And he says if there is any possibility of taking it tefillin and using them safely and appropriately and guarding their sanctity, one should do that. But otherwise, if one can't, one should follow the ruling of the aforementioned rabbis. And he ends by saying, as to many poskim with the tefillah at the end, that God should fulfill for us Kol hamachala asher santi b'mitzrayim lo asim alecha kini ani Hashem rofe'echa, pasuk from B'shalach, that the illness which I placed on Egypt, says God, this is at the time of the exodus from Egypt, I won't place on you because I am the Lord your healer. It's a very beautiful ending to that particular tshuva. I think tomorrow in Shul, we'll continue looking at some of Rabbi Weiss's tshuvot rather than going back to some of the Mishnah Berurah, and we'll see what other topics that we can cover in Shul tomorrow morning.